The station called Harmony's Edge floated in the darkness between stars like a silver wheel spinning slowly against the void. And inside its curved halls, the future of a dozen species was about to change forever. Ambassador Torvax of the Velith stood at the entrance of the grand amphitheater and watched the delegates arrive one by one, his crystalline body catching the light and throwing small rainbows across the polished floor. And he felt a deep sense of pride that his people had been chosen to host this historic summit. The MEMS, Galactic Concord, had existed for 3,000 years. A union of intelligent species who had agreed to settle their differences through diplomacy rather than war. And now humanity was about to join their ranks as the newest member. And Torvax had spent months preparing for this moment. He had studied humans extensively, reading every report and watching every recording the Concord's observers had gathered during 2 decades of watching Earth from afar. And what he had learned both fascinated and troubled him. Humans came from a world that the Concord classified as a Category 7 death planet, a place where the gravity was crushing and the atmosphere was corrosive and predators lurked in every shadow. And somehow these soft pink creatures had not only survived but thrived and built cities and developed technology and reached for the stars. The other delegates did not share his fascination. Commander Rethkai of the Dominion of Keth arrived with his entourage of warriors, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall, with scales the color of dried blood and 4 powerful arms that could crush stone. And they walked through the halls like they owned them. The Keth had been warriors for longer than most species had been civilized, and they had conquered 11 worlds before the Concord convinced them that trade was more profitable than conquest. And they had never let anyone forget their martial heritage. Rethkai spotted Torvax and approached with heavy footsteps that echoed through the corridor like thunder. Ambassador, he said in a voice that rumbled from deep in his chest, I see you have prepared quite the welcome for our new pets. Torvax's crystalline form flickered with displeasure, but he kept his voice calm and diplomatic. The humans are to be our partners, Commander, not our pets. And I would ask you to remember that this summit is meant to foster cooperation. Rethkai made a sound that might have been laughter, his mandibles clicking together in amusement. Cooperation, he repeated as if the word tasted bad. We shall see what these humans are made of soon enough. He walked past Torvax into the amphitheater, and the ambassador watched him go with a feeling of dread settling in his transparent chest. The human delegation arrived precisely on time, which Torvax had learned was unusual for their species, and he moved to greet them at the main entrance. There were 4 of them in total, and they seemed so small compared to the other species that filled the station. The 2 diplomats wore formal clothing in dark colors and smiled politely at everyone they passed. And behind them walked a tall man with gray hair and a chest covered in colorful ribbons that Torvax knew represented military honors. And the reports identified him as General Morrison, but it was the 4th human who caught the ambassador's attention. She was a female, smaller than the others, with dark hair pulled back tight against her head and eyes the color of earth after rain. And she wore a uniform of deep blue with fewer ribbons than the general, but enough to show she had seen combat. Name was Gunnery Sergeant Elena Vasquez, and she moved through the crowd of aliens with a quiet confidence that seemed almost out of place in someone so young. Torvax approached the delegation and made the traditional Velith greeting, a slight bow that caused his crystalline body to chime softly. Welcome to Harmony's Edge, he said through his translator. The Galactic Concord is honored to receive humanity on this historic day. General Morrison returned the bow with one of his own. Thank you, Ambassador. We are grateful for the warm welcome and look forward to working with all the member species. The words were polite and practiced, exactly what Torvax expected from a diplomat. But he noticed that Sergeant Vasquez remained silent. her eyes scanning the room with a focus that seemed almost predatory. The amphitheater filled quickly with representatives from 12 different species, each one taking their assigned seats in the curved rows that faced the central speaking platform. The Velith sat in their crystal chairs that resonated with their bodies, and the Keth sprawled in reinforced seats built to hold their massive frames, and the Mortheni floated in sealed tanks of ammonia that they breathed instead of air, and dozens of other beings filled the remaining space. Tervax took his position at the podium and activated the universal translation system that would convert his words into languages that every species could understand. Distinguished delegates, he began. We gather here today to discuss the integration of humanity into our joint military operations, a step that will require trust and understanding from all parties. The summit proceeded as expected for the first several hours, with discussions of fleet positioning and command structures and rules of engagement that were so boring that even Torvax found his attention wandering. Notice that Sergeant Vasquez sat perfectly still throughout the proceedings, never fidgeting or showing any sign of boredom, and he wondered what thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. Commander Rethkai grew increasingly restless as the hours passed, his forearms crossing and uncrossing and his tail sweeping back and forth across the floor. And Torvax could see that the warrior was looking for an opportunity to make trouble when the topic finally shifted to personnel integration and the possibility of mixed species units serving together. Rethkai saw his chance. He rose from his seat without being recognized, his massive form casting a shadow across half the amphitheater, and his voice boomed through the chamber with enough force to silence every other conversation. Before we continue, he announced, his four eyes sweeping across the room before settling on the human delegation. I believe we should address a fundamental question. Torvax felt his crystalline heart sink as he realized what was about to happen. We are discussing the possibility of placing our warriors under human command. Rethkai continued. But what do we truly know about human warriors? And what proof do we have that they are worthy of such trust? His gaze locked onto Sergeant Vasquez like a predator that had found its prey. You there, he called out, pointing one clawed finger directly at her. Female in the blue uniform, you wear the decorations of a warrior. Do not. Every eye in the amphitheater turned toward Vasquez, and the chamber fell completely silent. She met the commander's gaze without flinching and rose slowly from her seat. I am a Marine, she said in a voice that carried clearly despite its calm tone. And yes, these ribbons represent combat service. Rethkai's mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among his species. Excellent, he said. Then perhaps you can help us understand exactly what kind of warriors humanity produces. And in that moment, with the attention of 12 species focused on one small human female, the course of galactic history began to shift in ways that none of them could have predicted. The silence in the amphitheater was so complete that Vasquez could hear the soft hum of the translation devices working to convert every word into a dozen different languages. And she could feel the weight of alien eyes pressing down on her from every direction. Commander Rethkai descended from his elevated seat and walked toward the center of the chamber with steps that shook the floor, and his forearms hung loose at his sides in what she recognized as a fighter's ready stance. She had read the briefings on the Keth before leaving Earth, and she knew that they measured everything in terms of combat, that their entire culture revolved around strength and dominance and the glory of battle. And she understood exactly what game he was trying to play. Among my people, Rethkai said as he reached the central platform and turned to face the assembly, a warrior's worth is measured not by words or promises, but by deeds. And the greatest deed a warrior can claim is the defeat of enemies in personal combat. He struck his chest with two of his fists in what was clearly a gesture of pride. I have served the Dominion for 40 cycles, and in that time I have led 3 major campaigns against species who threatened our borders. And I have personally slain 847 enemies in combat. A murmur of impressed sounds rippled through the Keth delegation, and several other species made noises that their translators converted into expressions of respect. Rithake turned his 4 eyes back to Vasquez. This number is spoken with honor in the halls of my ancestors, and it marks me as one of the greatest warriors my generation has produced. He took another step toward her, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. So tell me, little human female, what is your kill count? General Morrison started to rise from his seat, his face tight with anger at the obvious attempt to embarrass their delegation. But Vasquez raised one hand slightly in his direction without taking her eyes off the massive alien in front of her. The Bailey. General hesitated and then settled back into his chair. Trusting her to handle the situation, Ambassador Torvax watched from the podium with his crystalline body flickering in distress, clearly wishing he could intervene, but knowing that any attempt to stop this confrontation would only make humanity look weak. Vasquez took a slow breath and let it out. Through her nose, she had been in worse situations than this, had faced enemies far more dangerous than an arrogant lizard with an inflated sense of his own importance. And she was not about to let him rattle her. Commander, she said in a voice that remained perfectly steady, before I answer your question, I need to ask for clarification. Rethkai's head tilted slightly in surprise, clearly not expecting her to respond with anything other than stammering or silence. Clarification, he repeated. Yes, sir, Vasquez continued. When you speak of kill count, are you referring specifically to confirmed kills in direct personal combat? The commander's chest swelled with pride at the question. Of course, he said. True warrior kills enemies that you faced with your own eyes and ended with your own hands or weapons. Not accidents or collateral damage or the impersonal destruction of orbital bombardment, but real combat where you risked your life against theirs. Vasquez nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied her. I understand, she said, that my confirmed kill count from direct personal combat is 231. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber, a mixture of surprise and grudging respect from some species and dismissive sounds from others. Rethkai's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. 231, he said. That is not nothing, I suppose, for a creature so small and fragile, but it is far from impressive when compared to a true warrior's record. He turned to address the rest of the amphitheater. You see, honored delegates, the humans are brave perhaps and willing to fight, but they are not the equals of species who have dedicated themselves to the art of war. Commander, Vasquez said, and something in her tone made him stop and turn back to face her. I was not finished. The chamber went silent again. 231 is my kill count from one engagement, she said. The battle for Kepler-4, which lasted 11 days. Rethkai blinked all 4 of his eyes. 11 days, he said slowly, as if he was not sure he had heard correctly. Yes, sir. 11 days of continuous combat against an enemy force that outnumbered us 8-1. And I was operating as a designated marksman, providing overwatch for evacuation corridors, while also engaging in direct ground combat when enemy forces breached our perimeter. She paused to let that sink in. My total confirmed kill count across 4 deployments during 6 years of active service is 1,417. The Keth delegation went completely still, and Rethkai's scales seemed to pale slightly as the blood drained from beneath them. Ambassador Torvax made a sound like breaking glass that his species produced when they were shocked beyond words. However, Vasquez continued in that same calm voice. I should tell you that this number is misleading. Rethkai's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Misleading how? The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and every being in the amphitheater leaned forward to hear the answer. Vasquez met his gaze without blinking. 1,417 is only the confirmed count. The enemies that I personally witnessed fall, and that were later verified by after-action reports. But combat is messy, and confirmation is not always possible. She took one step forward. Not aggressive, but simply closing the distance between them. When you are calling in artillery coordinates on enemy positions or providing targeting data for airstrikes or collapsing tunnel networks on forces moving underground, it becomes difficult to count individual kills. Rethkai said nothing. My unit's estimated total impact across my 4 deployments is closer to 12,000 enemy casualties. And as the ranking non-commissioned officer, I bear responsibility for those numbers as well. 12,000. The number seemed to echo through the chamber, even though she had spoken it no louder than anything else. A delegate from the Morthae species began speaking rapidly in their own language, and the translator struggled to keep up with what sounded like expressions of disbelief and fear. The Velith ambassador's crystalline form had gone completely dark, all the light within him extinguished by shock, and Commander Rethkai, the greatest warrior of his generation, stood frozen in place with his 4 arms hanging limp at his sides as he stared at the small human female who had just casually revealed that she had killed more enemies in 6 years than he had in 40. The game he had started was no longer going according to his plan. The amphitheater had become a tomb of silence, and in that silence, Sergeant Elena Vasquez stood like a statue carved from something harder than the stone beneath her feet. Commander Rethkai had not moved since she spoke the number 12,000, and his 4 eyes remained fixed on her face, as if he was searching for some sign that she was lying or exaggerating or playing some kind of elaborate joke. He found nothing but calm truth staring back at him. You expect me to believe, he finally managed to say, his voice rough and uncertain in a way it had never been before. Not a single human female has killed more enemies than our most decorated war leaders. Vasquez shook her head slowly. No, sir. I do not expect you to believe anything. I am simply answering the question you asked me with honest numbers that can be verified through official military records. She clasped her hands behind her back in a parade rest position that she had held 1,000 times before. But I think you may be misunderstanding something important about me and about humanity. Rethkai's mandibles clicked. Uncertainly, what am I misunderstanding? You called me out specifically, Vasquez said. You pointed at me and asked for my kill count, as if I was something special, as if my numbers would represent the best that humanity has to offer. She paused and swept her gaze across the amphitheater, meeting the eyes of delegates from a dozen different species. I am not special. Commander, I am not a hero or a legend or even particularly famous among my own people. I am simply a Marine who did her job. The words settled over the assembly like a cold wind. Back on Earth, there are tens of thousands of soldiers with records similar to mine, and hundreds of thousands who served before me with kill counts that would make mine look small by comparison. Ambassador Torvax finally found his voice. Sergeant Vasquez, he said, his crystalline form flickering with something between fascination and horror. How is this possible? Your species has only been traveling among the stars for a few decades. Where did you fight these battles? Vasquez turned to face him. We fought them against each other. Ambassador, a wave of confused murmurs swept through the chamber, and translation devices worked overtime to convey the meaning to species who could not comprehend what she was saying. I do not understand, Torvax said. You killed 12,000 of your own kind. Not my own kind specifically, Vasquez replied, but yes, humans. The enemies I fought were other humans who belonged to nations or factions that were at war with my nation. She looked back at Rethkai. We have been fighting each other for 10,000 years. Commander, since before we had metal or writing or any understanding of the stars above our heads. And in that time, we have gotten very, very good at killing. Rethkai took an involuntary step backward. 10,000 years. He repeated. Some of our historians would say longer. Vasquez continued. We have records of organized warfare going back to the earliest days of our civilization, and evidence that violence between groups existed long before that. She began to walk slowly across the central platform, and every eye in the chamber followed her movement. We have fought wars over land and resources and religion and ideology. We have fought wars over pride and honor and revenge. We have fought wars simply because we did not know how to stop fighting. Her voice remained calm and matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather rather than the bloody history of her entire species. We developed weapons that could kill one enemy at a time, and then weapons that could kill hundreds, and then weapons that could kill millions. And when we realized that those weapons might destroy our entire world, we did not stop building them. We simply built more and pointed them at each other and waited. The Morthani delegate in the ammonia tank made a sound of pure terror that needed no translation. We created entire academies dedicated to teaching young people how to kill more efficiently. Vasquez said, we wrote books and developed theories and turned warfare into a science. And we practiced that science on each other for generation after generation. She stopped walking and turned to face the full assembly. The 4 deployments I mentioned were not against alien species. They were against other humans in conflicts that most of the galaxy has never heard of and would not understand if they did. General Morrison sat in his seat with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on his sergeant. Knowing that she was saying things that the diplomats had hoped to keep quiet, but also knowing that she was right to say them. My nation has been at war somewhere in the world for almost my entire life. Vasquez continued, and it is not unusual or special. It is simply what we are, what we have always been. She looked directly at Commander Rethkai. You are proud of your 847 kills across 3 campaigns in 40 years of service. And you should be. It is an impressive number for any species. Her voice dropped lower. But you asked me to compare myself to you. And the truth is that we are not comparable. Because you come from a species that fights when it must. And I come from a species that has never known how to stop. Rethkai's scales had gone from pale to almost white. Why? He asked. And for the first time, his voice held no aggression or pride. Only confusion and something that might have been fear. Why would any species do this to itself? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment before she answered. I do not know. She finally said, I have asked myself that question many times, and I have never found an answer that satisfied me. She looked up at the stars visible through the observation windows above the amphitheater. But I can tell you this. Commander, we did not come to space looking for new enemies to fight. We came hoping that maybe out here among the stars we might finally find a reason to stop. The weight of her words pressed down on the assembly like a physical force. And in that moment, every species in the chamber began to understand that humanity was something they had never encountered before, not a young species. Stumbling into space, not primitive savages to be conquered or controlled, but survivors of an endless war against themselves. Hardened by millennia of bloodshed into something that even the greatest warriors in the galaxy could not match. The amphitheater remained frozen in the aftermath of Vasquez's words, and for nearly a full minute, no one moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe. Ambassador Torvax was the first to break the silence, his crystalline body slowly beginning to glow again as he processed what he had heard. Sergeant Vasquez, he said carefully, the Concord has observed your world for 2 decades, and we knew that humanity had a violent history. But we did not understand the scale of what you are describing. Vasquez turned to face him, with respect. Ambassador, I am not sure you could have understood even if you had seen it directly, because violence on this scale is not something that most species can comprehend without having lived through it. A delegate from a species called the Thuric, small insectoid beings who communicated through a combination of sounds and pheromones, rose from their seat and spoke in a voice that clicked and buzzed. "How is your species still alive?" they asked through the translator. "How have you not destroyed yourselves completely?" It was a question that Vasquez had asked herself many times. "We came close," she admitted. "More than once we stood on the edge of extinction with our fingers on the buttons that would have ended everything. And somehow we stepped back every time." She paused. "I wish I could tell you that we stepped back because we learned from our mistakes or because we found wisdom. But the truth is that I do not know why we survived. Maybe luck, or maybe fear, or maybe something else that I cannot name." Commander Rethkai had finally regained some of his composure, though his scales were still pale and his posture had lost all of its earlier aggression. "You said you came to space hoping to find a reason to stop," he said slowly. "What does that mean?" Vasquez considered the question carefully before answering. "For as long as our history records, we have fought because we believed we had no choice. Because resources were limited, or because threats were real, or because enemies would destroy us if we did not destroy them first." She gestured toward the stars visible through the windows. "But space is not limited. There are more worlds and more resources than we could ever use. And the species of the Concord have shown that cooperation is possible. That enemies can become allies." Her voice softened slightly. "We hoped that maybe out here things could be different. That we could become something other than what we have always been." General Morrison rose from his seat and walked to stand beside his sergeant, his presence a silent statement of support. "The sergeant speaks for many of us," he said. "Humanity's military exists to protect our people. But we do not celebrate war the way some species seem to believe. We do not dream of conquest or glory." He looked at Rethkai directly. "We dream of a day when soldiers like Sergeant Vasquez are no longer necessary. When the skills we have spent millennia perfecting can finally be laid aside." The chamber absorbed these words in silence. Delegate from the Oshari, a species of tall willowy beings with silver skin and eyes like pools of darkness, raised one long arm to request permission to speak. "You speak of peace," they said in a voice like wind through leaves. "But your numbers tell a different story. If humanity is as deadly as your sergeant claims, then how can any species trust you not to turn that deadliness against them?" It was the question that Vasquez had been waiting for, the one that mattered more than all the others. "You cannot," she said simply. The chamber erupted in alarmed murmurs and sounds of distress. Vasquez raised her hand and waited for quiet before continuing. "You cannot trust us based on our words alone, because words are easy and mean nothing without actions to support them. And we have not been among you long enough to prove ourselves through actions." She stepped forward and spread her hands in a gesture of openness. "All I can offer you is this truth. Humanity has learned through bitter experience what war really costs. We have paid that cost over and over again for thousands of years. And we are tired." Her voice carried a weight of exhaustion that went deeper than any physical fatigue. "We are so very tired of burying our children and mourning our friends and watching our cities burn. We are tired of teaching each new generation to kill and then sending them off to die in wars that solve nothing." She looked around the chamber at the faces of a dozen different species. "You ask how you can trust us. And my answer is that we want peace more desperately than you can possibly understand. Because we know what the alternative looks like." Ambassador Torvax moved to the edge of the platform. "Sergeant," he said gently, "you carry a great burden. I can see it in you now in a way that I could not see before." Vasquez met his eyes. And for just a moment, some of the mask she wore seemed to slip. "We all carry it, Ambassador. Every human who has ever lived has carried the weight of what we are and what we have done. Some of us just carry more than others. The Thuric delegate spoke again. What would you have us do with this information? How should we proceed knowing what we now know? General Morrison answered before Vasquez could speak. We ask only that you give us a chance to prove that we can be more than our history. To show through our actions that humanity can be a partner instead of a threat. He looked at each delegation in turn. We will serve alongside your forces. We will follow your rules and respect your cultures. And if we fail to live up to our promises, then you will have every right to cast us out. Commander Rethkai stepped forward slowly. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and thoughtful in a way. It had not been since the summit began. I have been a warrior for 40 years, he said. I thought I understood what it meant to be deadly. I thought my people were the greatest fighters in the galaxy. He looked at Vasquez with something that might have been respect. I was wrong. And I am not too proud to admit it. He turned to face the other delegates. The Dominion of Kath will support humanity's integration into the Concord's military operations. Not because we do not fear them, but because warriors who have survived what they have survived deserve the chance to find another path. It was not forgiveness or trust. Not yet, but it was a beginning. The summit did not continue that day, and Ambassador Torvax quietly announced a recess that everyone understood was necessary. Delegates filed out of the amphitheater in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that their translators struggled to capture. And the conversations that filled the corridors of Harmony's Edge were unlike any that had taken place there before. Kath delegation departed without ceremony. Commander Rethkai walking at their head with his eyes fixed straight ahead. And as he passed Sergeant Vasquez, he paused for just a moment. No words were exchanged between them. But something passed in that silence, some acknowledgement between warriors that transcended language and species. And then Rethkai continued on his way and disappeared around. A corner General Morrison found Vasquez an hour later on the observation deck at the far end of the station. A small room with curved windows that looked out at the endless darkness between. Stars. She stood alone with her hands clasped behind her back, her reflection ghostly in the glass, and she did not turn when she heard his footsteps behind her. That was not in the briefing. Gunny, Morrison said as he came to stand beside her. No, sir. It was not. Morrison was quiet for a moment, watching the distant lights of stars that humans had named, but never visited. The diplomats are going to have a lot of questions about what you said in there, and they are not going to be happy with the answers. Vasquez nodded slowly. I know, sir. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences come from my actions. Morrison let out a long breath. You could have given them smaller numbers. You could have played along with the game and let us maintain the image of humanity as young and harmless and eager to learn. He turned to look at her profile. Why did you tell them the truth? Vasquez was silent for so long that Morrison thought she might not answer. But finally she spoke in a voice that was softer than anything he had heard from her before. Because they needed to know, sir. Not to fear us, but to understand us. She turned to face him, and her eyes held a depth of weariness that made her look decades older than her years. Every species in that room thinks they understand violence. They think that because they have fought wars and lost soldiers, they know what we are talking about when we speak of peace. Her jaw tightened. They do not know. They cannot know. Because they have never stood where we stand. She looked back at the stars. The Kath are proud of their conquests, but they have never faced an enemy as ruthless as their own people. The Velith have never had to make the choice between pushing a button and ending a civilization or watching their children grow up under enemy occupation. Her voice dropped lower. We have made those choices, sir. We have stood at those crossroads and walked away carrying the weight of what we decided. And that weight is what makes us different. Morrison said nothing because he knew she was right. If we had pretended to be less than we are, Vasquez continued. then every promise of peace we made would have been a lie built on a foundation of deception. And lies do not last. Not in war and not in diplomacy. She unclenched her hands and let them hang at her sides. But if they know the truth, if they understand that when humanity offers peace, it is not because we are weak or afraid, but because we have seen the alternative and we choose to be better, then maybe that peace can actually mean something. Morrison studied her face in the reflected starlight. You really believe we can change? That humanity can become something other than what we have always been? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. I have to believe it, sir. Because if I did not believe it, then every life I have taken and every friend I have buried would mean nothing. And I cannot accept that. She met his eyes. We are not good people, sir. Humanity as a whole. We have done terrible things to each other, and we will probably do terrible things again. But we are also capable of kindness and sacrifice and love. And I have to believe that the second part can win over the first. Morrison nodded slowly. The brass is going to want a full report on what happened today. Yes, sir. And you are probably going to spend the next several months answering questions from intelligence officers and diplomats and anyone else who wants to understand what makes humans tick. I expected as much, sir. Morrison put his hand on her shoulder. For what it is worth, Gunny, I think you did the right thing. And I will make sure the brass knows that I supported your decision. Thank you, sir. He left her alone on the observation deck. And Vasquez turned back to the stars. Somewhere out there were worlds that humanity would never visit, and species they would never meet, and wonders they could not imagine. And all of it was waiting for a species that had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy itself. She thought about the numbers she had spoken in the amphitheater. The cold statistics that represented lives ended by her hands and her orders. And she felt the weight of them pressing down on her like it always did. But she also felt something else. Something that might have been hope. 2 weeks later, the Galactic Concord formally ratified humanity's full membership. And the vote was unanimous. 1 month after that, the Keth Dominion submitted an official request for human military advisors to be assigned to their sectors. Not as subordinates, but as equals, whose experience could help them understand threats they had never faced before. 3 months later, Ambassador Torvax published a paper on human psychology that became required reading for every species in the Concord. And in it he wrote words that would be quoted for generations to come. Do not mistake human gentleness for weakness, or their desire for peace as a lack of will to fight. For humanity has proven beyond all doubt that they are capable of violence on a scale that defies comprehension. And yet they choose every day to reach for something better. That choice is not weakness, but strength of a kind we have never seen. And we would do well to learn from it. And throughout the galaxy a saying began to spread. Passed from species to species in 1,000 different languages. A warning and a tribute wrapped into a single phrase. Pray you never meet a human who has stopped counting. Elena Vasquez heard the saying for the first time 6 months later. And she smiled sadly because she understood what it meant. It meant that the galaxy had finally learned to see humanity not as it appeared, but as it truly was. Survivors, fighters, and dreamers of a peace they had never known but refused to stop reaching for.